Today I'm going to take you through some of the meta developments that we've seen in the early parts of kickoff in VCT. And the first one is the title of this video. Valorant is in its best ever meta. And I do truly mean that, because if you take a look at some of the pick rates, like here's the pick rates for America's kickoff thus far, the top agent is Omen at 54%. And this America's number here of 54% is the highest of any number in any of the regions. 54% is the highest of any agent anywhere. And that is extraordinarily low for the highest pick agent in any region, because in the past we have seen not just agents get into the 60%, but even the 70% pushing 80%. We saw it, of course, last year with an agent like Omen. In the past, we've seen it with Vipers and your Chambers and Jets and Sovas, you know, be way up there above 60%. As I said, some of them into 70% potentially as well. So to have your highest agent be 54% is really quite encouraging across any region. And the thing is as well, of course, Omen is a controller, right? And on every map, you're at least going to play one controller, right? So there's probably always, no matter what meta it is, you're probably always going to have at least one controller agent who is pushing around 50%. And very interestingly as well, in EMEA, the highest pick agent is actually Astra with 50%. So what's really, really promising about this is that the highest number for any agent really isn't that high. And it probably always will be a controller who's always, you know, hovering around those numbers, but it's not even the same controller in all of the regions either that is the highest picked agent. On top of that as well, at the other end of the scale, every single agent has been picked apart from Reyna. We have seen every other agent at least once, and you know, most agents are seeing a pretty healthy level of play. So I would say that right now, 2025, early on in the VCT season, this is the greatest, most, you know, fresh, kind of interesting meta that we've had in Valorant. And of course, to get that meta, we had to have a multiple of variable factors that all happened to happen at a good time. And one of them, of course, was Teo coming out, because Teo is the first agent, I would say, in a while that's been released. And upon release, you know, the hype was pretty strong, and people thought, ooh, this is an agent that could potentially, you know, be very strong right out of the gate. It's been a while since we've had that kind of agent, and of course, an agent like that will shake up the meta. But it's not just that about Teo. What I think is even more interesting about Teo, in terms of his impact on the meta, is that Teo, and what we've seen so far from Teo, is that he is a combo agent, of course. Whether that's his signature ability or his ult as well, you want to be comboing those abilities with other abilities to get good value from them. And so that creates a bit of a dilemma for the teams, where you might think that Omen is better than Astra on a map. But if you're playing Teo, maybe you pick Astra because the Gravwell could be a potential combo partner, or same thing for Neon or Yoru or Jet versus Raze, or similar things for, you know, are we going to play a Deadlock on this map all of a sudden, whereas before we might not have done, right? Or a Fade for a Sova instead, right? All of those little combos that you might get with a Teo that you otherwise wouldn't have done is quite interesting, and that can also lead to other things as well, right? For instance, we've seen some teams play Teo Yoru because they want the Yoru so that they can have the flashes, right? So they can have still the normal pop flashes out of smokes and stuff like that, but they don't want to sacrifice too much else in their comp. They maybe want to play Teo Sova or Teo Fade and still have a full recon initiator as well. We've seen other teams kind of forego some of the information stuff and instead play Teo Breach on maps. And I think it's been quite interesting of trying to figure out where teams think Teo can fit, and some of kind of the comp problems that he might require you to solve as well, with other agents bringing them into your comp. Now, it is America's as well that has been the highest on Teo so far. They have picked him at a 39% pick rate, the fourth most picked agent in America's overall, which is really quite something early on. So America's heavily leaning into it. The other regions haven't nearly leaned into it as much. Pacific is only 14%, EMEA is only 24%, and China is only 8%. Now, with China, of course, they started earlier, so they had less time from when Teo, you know, kind of fully released, so that makes sense. But clearly, Americas are leaning into Teo much more than some of the other regions. Another thing we've seen, which was kind of a holdover from towards the end of last year, but now has, I think, been developed and kind of fully fleshed out, and we're seeing the fruits of that, is a double Sentinel comp. Now, double Sentinel comps haven't really existed outside of some very niche scenarios on certain maps, like perhaps, playing Sage Killjoy on Icebox back in the day. But outside of like kind of niche, like one map only kind of things, we haven't really seen double Sentinel really ever be kind of a strong meta presence. But right now it is. Now, as I said, this kind of started, I think, towards the end of 2024. We saw teams like Trace and others, playing like Deadlock Cypher. And the idea is, that you're trying to overcome some of the lack of initiation power by basically seeing like a Cypher Cam as an initiation tool, right? As kind of your info tool, almost like you would with, using a Cypher Cam like you might a Sova Dart in a sense. Now, of course, the Cypher Cam isn't nearly as effective as a Sova Dart at doing that, but, it can, in theory, potentially, kind of mitigate some of those risks for you. But that idea with the Cypher was maybe successful for the odd game or two, but I don't think it had kind of longevity. It didn't have long-lasting legs. However, Vice has now been out for a while, and people have been learning how to play Vice, and also Vice has received some buffs in the time as well from the end of last year. So now we have Vice as that kind of replacement, and Vice, I think, is the kind of Sentinel who can be more of that kind of initiation, right? You have a flash. It's easier to place, on the other side of walls than, say, a Cypher Cam is, right? It gives you information. And so you have perhaps a bit more, availability to, forego another initiator if you want to play Vice Deadlock. And we have seen Vice Deadlock across actually quite a few different maps. Most notably, I think it's Bind, though, which is where it's been most interesting, because on Bind, the meta for pretty much ever has been to play double controller with Viper. But now, people are starting to actually think, is this a direction we can go with Deadlock Vice, who both in their own right are very good on Bind and very strong as well, and together create this combo of just awful to play against when they're on the defense side. Having to get through the Deadlock and Vice stuff on a small map like Bind is absolute cancer, and you have just enough stuff and enough combo tools on the attack side, with like a Gravnet nade for instance, to potentially make the attack side still work. And if you ever get the spike down, good luck trying to retake against a Vice Deadlock comp. And on that note, speaking about Sentinels as well, are we seeing the death of the trad Sentinel? Well, maybe. Because when you take a look at Cypher and Killjoy's pick rates, they definitely are down from last season, and we are seeing more kind of Sentinel-less comps, or certainly not playing kind of your traditional info Sentinel like a Cypher or a Killjoy in quite a lot of these comps. Now, they aren't completely dead, don't worry, we are still seeing a fair bit of Cypher, it must be said. His pick rates is still in kind of like the top 10 agents, so it's not like Cypher is completely dying. Killjoy, on the other hand, outside of Pacific, for whatever reason, Pacific still seems to think that Killjoy is pretty good. The rest of the world seems to be less on the Killjoy train, and Killjoy's pick rate has significantly fallen down. But even if they are still getting picked a little bit, they definitely are significantly down from where they were in the previous season, and this is quite interesting, I think, because it's not just maps like Split and Bind, where we have seen, no Sentinel comps before, right? Like, that's happened pretty much throughout the history on those maps. It's actually maps that you probably wouldn't expect there to be no Sentinel on, right? Big maps, like Abyss, or 3-site maps, like Lotus, where teams are foregoing having that traditional Sentinel role for that extra information. And you really wouldn't expect that, right? People would have probably in the past told you, hey, on like big maps or maps like a Lotus where there's 3 sites, you're gonna need that extra information, right? But teams right now are just saying, no, we don't. No, I don't think we do need that extra information, which is very, very interesting. And it's kind of an interesting philosophical point, because by not picking those kind of agents on a map like Lotus, for instance, you probably, when you're on your defense side, it might cost you a round or two. But I think that teams are basically saying, hey, it's fine if we lose a round because someone lurked through B and they got us in one round. But it's not going to happen every round. And if it is only like one round in the game, well, we can afford to lose that round, because the advantages of picking something else where, we're adding into our combos, or we're adding, extra, big execs or stuff like that, is worth it, not playing the traditional Sentinel. And so that is creating an interesting, dynamic in the game as well, where we are seeing a shift, to like Vitality playing triple initiator on Abyss, or on Lotus we're seeing teams, play the EDG comp from Champs last year, where it's just like all guns blazing, don't care. And the final thing I want to talk about is Neon, because Neon's place in the game is also quite interesting right now. Because, of course, during the midway through the off-season, everyone thought this was going to be a heavy Neon meta. That's pretty much what we all thought. But then, of course, Neon got a pretty significant nerf. And then everyone thought that Neon was completely dead. And what's interesting is, Neon basically is dead in a couple regions, but isn't in a couple of the other regions. That's what's been kind of interesting right now. Because if you're in Asia, if you're in China, or if you're in Pacific, Neon's pick rate is still about 30%. But in EMEA and Americas, it's 3 and 4%. So basically a dead agent that, you know, maybe one team is picking one time on a certain map. So that's quite an interesting dynamic. And of course, some of those Neon stats are being carried by certain teams like Nongshim, who do still lean into the Neon very, very heavily. But I think when you look at Nongshim play and you see them play Neon, it still looks kind of decent. It still actually looks like somewhat viable if you have someone on Neon who is incredible at that agent. You know, there's still a lot of value to be found if you are extremely good on Neon. So basically, the Asian Neon lives, but in the rest of the world, Neon is kind of dead. But those were 5 interesting kind of meta takeaways. As I say, I think that this probably is the most interesting meta that Valorant has ever had. I think it's the most open meta. I think if you go through all of the agent pool, there's quite a lot of agents that you can go, they're pretty good. And that's creating a very, very interesting meta right now, where it seems like there's a lot of potential strong stuff that you can do on a lot of the maps.